Kia ora, hello and Guten Tag. Welcome to Berlin Wall Stories, an exhibition that was commissioned by the German Embassy in Wellington in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It explores the perspectives of 10 unique people and their relationship with the Berlin Wall, a concrete wall that once divided East and West Berlin, and the border strip that ran between the Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic. You're about to hear a recorded interview with one of our participants who shared their personal Mauergeschichte, their Berlin Wall story. Enjoy and viel Spaß beim Zuhören.
First of all, I think speaking about a childhood in the GDR is a quite interesting thing because I'm 42 right now. So I was 8, 9 when the wall came down, and people would say, hey Mareike, how can you even talk about the East, because you've been a child when the wall came down. However, even when being a child, you have experiences in your childhood. You are going to primary school or you went to kindergarten. And of course, when the wall came down, nothing just changed overnight. Of course, a political system changed overnight, but your parents are continuing your parents, and your parents are people, humans who grew up in the GDR and who still keep on living the life that they used to live before the wall came down. And nothing in your immediate surrounding, and especially when you're a child, nothing that is important to you changes. You keep on going to school with the same kids. You keep on having more or less, or I had more or less the same teachers in school. It just changed over time after the wall came down. But what I think is very interesting, specifically when I think about my childhood, only in the most recent years I contemplated and reflected more about my childhood in the GDR and what was great and what was not so great. And the older I get, I would say there are more and more things that I'm criticizing. For example, how kindergarten was run and how the kindergarten teachers took care, and I'm making air quotation marks here, took care of you, and also how a school was run, because GDR was a collective society and it was not about the individual kid as much as it is, fortunately, right now, these days. Back then, you had to do what the kindergarten teacher or what the school teacher is telling you, even though you as a kid didn't feel like this. These were common things that were happening during kindergarten time. So, Alex, you were asking me about probably more the fun, positive childhood memories, but this was also part of my memories of my childhood that only came back to my mind or back to memory over the most recent years, when I was more able to put things into different perspectives.
It's interesting that sometimes you process things when you're an adult, like much later in life, because I'm actually happy that you're talking about this, because it was, we as people from the East, we want the others to see the East as not that bad place that is always portrayed. But of course, it was a very strict system. This is how it worked.
When I'm talking about the GDR, I would strongly differentiate between what the system made us doing or expected us to do, but there was also a different side of the whole story, which was private life in the family, with friends. I grew up in a village, and just recently I had a long conversation with my mom. We often have these conversations about how was it back then in the GDR? How do you remember things? How do I remember things? And we were talking about how was life in the GDR on the countryside, opposing to how was life in the cities. And I'm pretty sure that on the countryside, even though we had even less access to objects of demand, in the sense of specific books that was easier to buy when you were living in a city, or maybe it was even easier in a city to buy specific furniture. So when you were living in the village countryside, there weren't stores where you just could buy whatever you were looking for to buy. So there was limited access to things. And because of this limited access to things, people were more self-sufficient and more helping out each other. So there was more this kind of community sense. So when someone passed by the little grocery store in our village, for example, and there was a very rare delivery of a couple of boxes of bananas. So this is like the classic example, probably. The word was spread in no time that a delivery of bananas arrived. So everyone basically ran to the grocery store and bought bananas, or someone bought bananas for the neighbors or for the child that was living at the other side of the road, or whatever. You get the idea, right? So there was this sense of community, and there was this sense of helping out each other, and there was this sense of even families are living closer to each other and helping out each other. And I would say I had a really cool childhood, despite all these stories from the kindergarten that I see differently now as I'm an adult. But I grew up with my grandparents living next doors, and when my parents were working full time, which was no problem at all. I think even the opposite. I think seeing my mom as a role model, working full time, earning her own money, even having a higher education degree than my dad. And it didn't matter. So everyone was proud of my mom, but we were also proud of my dad, who was a painter. And everyone was proud of whatever they were doing. It didn't matter whether it was like a higher education degree or a lower education degree. It didn't matter. It mattered that my mom was a working mom, and I was proud of her. And my grandmother took care of me. And I think I would even say that I got more responsible for things earlier in my life, because I was able to maybe even cook pasta and tomato sauce earlier in my life that maybe other people were able to do so. So I had a really cool childhood with my mom even sewing clothes for me, because there was not a high choice of, I don't know, denim jeans. There was one specific very ugly denim jeans that you could maybe buy in GDR. But my mom, she was sewing clothes for me. So
classic. You always should have someone who's sewing clothes in the GDR time, right? There was always someone who did the really nice jeans or the jackets or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. Or even knitting sweaters or something like that. So, and my friends and I, we were running around in the meadows and forests that were like behind the last houses of our village. It was a great childhood. I really liked it, because we were also not political, and this is also something very important. I think it was possible to live a life in the GDR in somewhat a niche when you're not political. It was almost impossible to be not political, I think. But my family somehow managed to be non-political, or living kind of under the radar of having to be political, if this makes any sense.
Did that come with any cost? Like, say, because I can imagine you still had to stick to the rules of that society and how they worked. Yeah. So if you would have not done that, they would have come after you, I suppose, and your family, like, that you should, stick to how we do things. So was your family rather a little bit revolutionary by not doing this, or how did that work? Did it be not political?
It did work in the sense of they were not opposing the system. They kind of didn't care about the system. So we were lucky enough to live in a village. First of all, in a village of 500 people. And second of that, the companies, or I wouldn't even call this companies where my parents worked. It was just places where parents worked, because everything was state-run. They were small enough to not having this serious, crazy hierarchy that also this dictatorship, this system of the GDR supported, even though it was like officially a collective society and everyone was the same and everyone worked towards the same goal. But we were able, for whatever reason, to live a life in peace, far from being actively political as, for example, taking part in specific assemblies. Of course, my parents probably had to take part in some assemblies at their workplaces, but they were not the ones who were arguing, but they also were not the ones who were proposing things. So they probably survived because they kept their mouths shut. People could argue, okay, when you keep your mouth shut, you're a supporter of the system. But I would rather say my parents were 30 when the wall came down, 30 years old. I was 8 or 9. They became parents when they were 21. They just tried to create a life. So they kept their life shut to enable us to live a life outside of political oppression.
Do you remember, even though you were very young, if in your household they talked about politics or was that something they wanted to keep away from you as a child?
I don't remember specifically. However, I remember something. So my grandfather worked for a company that produced sunshades. And he was the guy driving a truck and delivering these sunshades to basically all places in the GDR, including governmental places in East Berlin. So he probably saw things, heard things, and knew things. However, after a week in which he was away delivering all these sunshades, he came back, but he never talked about anything what he saw, heard, or knew. I often, after the wall came down and when I was a young adult, I asked my grandmother, what did Grandpa told you? And she was like, he always kept his mouth shut to protect us as a family. So, and this is something I remember. There were years in summer when friends from East Berlin came visiting. So there was this couple. There was this energetic woman and her husband who visited every summer for a couple of days. And I remember they were cooking jams with my grandmother, and they basically destroyed all the tea towels because blueberry and raspberry and, blackberry juice was all over the place. And back then, of course, I was a child. I never really understood who these people were. And they were always introduced as, these are our friends from East Berlin. And guess what? After the wall came down, they never showed up again. And then many, many years later, in a conversation, these people came up again. And I asked my grandmother, who were these people? And my grandmother, she laughed and laughed and laughed her ass off. And she said, this was the Stasi, Mareike. This was the Stasi visiting us every summer to get an idea of what your granddad might have told his family about what he saw here or have seen in East Berlin when he was delivering the sunshades.
Amazing. Yeah, I was just going to ask you about the Stasi.
Yeah. So
they just wanted to check on the family and what he's told them.
Yes, exactly. And this is something, I was a kid back then. I didn't probably get everything that the adults were talking about, but this was common knowledge. No one talked about. And even after the wall came down, I said this came up in a conversation many, many years after the wall came down. And my grandmother, she was surprised that I didn't know. Of course, I couldn't know as a kid. But it gave me also the notion or the idea, everyone knew. But no one ever talked about this. Everyone knew and everyone just acted accordingly. And in hindsight, my grandfather did a really good job in protecting us as a family by never sharing anything what he saw or heard. And when these people came, it apparently never had a consequence because there was never any kind of other police showing up or no one got ever arrested. So my grandfather did a great job in protecting our family.
I can imagine that if young people are hearing this now, it sounds weird. Yes, okay, there was the Stasi police, but how, you said your granddad was a truck driver who delivered stuff also to the government. Okay, but there must have been so many truck drivers delivering stuff. So was there always someone who came to the family to visit, to check on them if they knew something. Like, this is a very complex system, obviously, and this sounds weird. So if say a student, one of your students comes to you and says, Mareike, why did that happen, or what was how was that actually organized? What would you answer?
The Stasi had their networks everywhere. And these two people visiting from East Berlin were by far not the only people working for the Stasi, and also not in this little village where I grew up. There was the Stasi all around, and there were rumors, or like after the wall came down, there were rumors. Oh, this person might have worked for the Stasi, or that person also might have worked for the Stasi. So there was this whole thing of being suspicious of each other, basically. But this was always on a different level. And I think East Germans or citizens of the GDR were very good in creating a language in which to communicate about things that they criticized about the system. And they created a language in sharing information and sharing experiences by not naming them, just hinting or jokes or metaphors, or I don't know. Even today, sometimes I think East Germans are generally not the biggest communicators. However, they're pretty good in communicating in maybe a way that is not just words. It's also about body language, behavior, and the way to create relationships and bonds, which is very easily done with not a lot of words. Sometimes it's just it's hard to, it's maybe even banal, but when you go to a bar in an East German town and you just go and sit down at a counter at a bar and you say, na, something like just na, wie geht's, what's up? This is enough to tell a story. And it's also about the emphasis on how you're uttering sentences, little tiny words, that also already tell a story. There's a lot of how you behave, how you look, like how's the look in your eyes, how you look to each other, that tells stories. So there's a different language that it's almost like a code that also only East Germans understand. And this is also something that I experienced in my first job that brought me to Poland. And there I worked together with colleagues that also taught German from East Germany and West Germany. And there was this specific body language that gave away who were from which part of the country. And there was this immediate connection to people because you felt a familiarity. And then in the conversation you found out, oh yeah, this person is also from the East. So there is body language, the way people look at each other. It's a very specific way to communicate that maybe it's very subjective. Of course, it's very subjective what I'm sharing. But I can imagine this is also a consequence or a result of that back in the GDR you were not allowed to say everything out loud that you might have wanted to. Yeah.
And you got influenced by your parents and by my parents. And actually, thank you for pointing this out. This is a very important, interesting thing, in which actually makes me quite emotional. Yeah, because I agree. I could not find the words for it, but you explained it beautifully. Thank you for that.
Probably we could just fast forward a little bit and say, talk about that big shift that every Eastern German family went through after the wall came down, or probably even just before it. I don't know if you have any experiences before it, because some people describe that time just before the wall came down as very tense and exciting as well, because everybody was talking about maybe it's going to happen, maybe not. Is there any memory you have from that time?
Not really, and this is very weird. So what I remember is blurry things, just like flashlights on us sitting in front of the TV together. So my grandparents were living next doors in their own house next to ours. And I remember us sitting like the weeks and months before the wall actually came down, sitting together in front of the TV and watching the news and trying to understand. Well, this is what I'm interpreting now, trying to understand what was going on. Because back then, I don't remember a lot of conversations at all. I don't even remember comments while we were watching TV. We were just watching TV and following the news because, well, this is like 35 years ago. And in the last years, probably last 15 years, when I started to think about more in depth about all and everything what happened in the 80s and also in the 90s. And I think in hindsight, when I'm contemplating about these moments when we were sitting in front of the TV, it was something that happened somewhere else. And basically no one was really sure about how much it would impact us, because we had no such situation ever before. And we just didn't know what was going on and in which way it would impact our lives. Would it even impact our lives? Because this is happening in Berlin, right? And we were living in this 500 people village in the Thuringian forest. Maybe we were really naive. Of course we were naive, because this is how people kind of were back then, especially when not wanting to be involved in things. So there was this, I don't know, this passive watching things and probably being also aware of maybe something is going to happen with us, but what can we do about this?
Right, because in the lead up to the fall, the actual fall, Monday demonstrations started in Leipzig. I mean, it was still quite far from where you lived, perhaps, but as far as I'm aware of it was like all over the GDR were a few Monday demonstrations in different sizes. When your family heard about those, was there any reaction?
I don't remember any of these. No, it's something that happened somewhere else. So this is probably a good way to sum the situation up. All of this was something happening somewhere else, and we were watching it passively, not sure what to make out of it. And a lot of people, I'm aware of that, a lot of people, when they think back about these times, they remember like a vibrant, there's a change in the air. I don't even remember that. And whenever I talk to my parents about these years back then, they also don't remember like a vibrant change in the air. It's nothing that they ever mentioned. My mom, she's a accountant. She was an accountant in the GDR, and after the wall came down, she was studying business administration. So she's a very down-to-earth, rational, pragmatic person. And she said in hindsight, she had the feeling something is happening and the economy will be totally different. So this was her approach to it. But there was nothing like an emotional vibrancy in the air that I remember, or that my parents or grandparents ever mentioned. No.
Right, and 9th of November, 1989, so many things happened. Did that reach like you guys in the little village straight away, or was it the same thing that you really had to kind of process first, and then eventually you grabbed your car, you went over the border without any restrictions? Do you remember that day, or maybe even through conversations with your parents, because you were quite young? What happened for your family that day?
I remember this. We were just sitting together in my grandmother's living room and watching the pictures on the TV. And we, of course, as I said before, we didn't know, or my grandparents didn't know what to make out of it. And it took a couple of days to process, I guess. Because I should not generalize, but people in the GDR, or there were a lot of people in the GDR that were very hesitant and not very active. Of course, there were people who probably immediately, when they heard that the wall came down, they put cats, dogs, kids, luggage in the car and went to see what actually was happening. They wanted to be part of it in Berlin. But my family was rather this group of people, like the silent, maybe some kind of a silent group of people who were just watching and still watching and taking some time to process what's going on and to kind of take some time to think about this.
So there was no big celebration. Woohoo, the wall was down.
No. It was rather like, okay, so now things will probably change in a way, but we don't know in which way. So, but for now, in our village, we are safe, this kind of. So we'll see what's going to happen. This is happening kind of far away, and there was no internet, and there was not that you could take a train to, I don't know, to Berlin and be there in a couple of hours. No. And taking a Trabi to Berlin would take half a day because it's a slow car. But anyway, my point I was also wanting to get to, that eventually we did also take this trip to the West. So my parents put me in the Trabi, and we went over to Hessen, which is the bordering province, Bundesland, to Thuringia. And of course, we also made that trip to this big warehouse to buy clothes. Like, of course, we had clothes in the GDR, but not cool clothes. So I got my first real denim jeans and a cool jacket, and something that was very important, especially for kids at my age. I actually got a so-called Walkman as a present. So a Walkman, this is something that's probably not existing anymore. So this is a portable tape player or cassette player, tape recorder thingy, and you had like little headphones, and it was, I don't know, it was this tiny thing you could put in your pocket and listen to music, or I don't know, like.
Did you listen to like David Hasselhoff?
Of course, it's like the classic. I've been looking for freedom, and the Scorpions' Wind of Change. It's all these songs that come along with this time, and then in the 90s there was all these Europop songs and like this techno pop stuff. Ridiculous music. But anyway, so this was a very important thing to have. And I remember back then it cost 29 mark and 20 Pfennig.
The Walkman.
The Walkman.
It's a very exact price.
Yes, because I remember this. And this was a red black thingy. And I was so proud of having something like this, because I was 8 or 9 years old, and then suddenly having this technical device from the West, you know, that allowed me to listen to music and like these little, not podcasts, how do you call it, like audiobooks, while I was Benjamin Blümchen. So this is like the audiobook from the West, or Bibi Blocksberg. It's all these titles that now come to mind again, which is quite funny. This was amazing. And then I also remember the very moment when we crossed that border. Of course, there was a long queue of cars trying to get to the West. And there were so many people from the West applauding and cheering on us. And then something very weird happened. So there was this, I think it was 30 marks that every person got as a so-called Begrüßungsgeld, like a welcoming money amount.
I thought it was 100.
Was it 100?
100 per person?
Maybe it was 100 marks per person. But this is not something, as you can tell, that really stuck to my mind. But what stuck to my mind is that people handed us plastic bags full of not newspapers, but magazines and catalogs. So there were these warehouses where you could order by mail Neckermann and Otto and Quelle, and they were handing us bags and bags full of these catalogs, and we were so grateful for basically getting the old crappy papers, because they wanted to get rid of it, and probably they also thought they would do us something good in giving us these catalogs. But we were just amazed to see all these colorful products on these bricks of catalogs with 1,000 pages that you could order. So suddenly the whole world of materialism opened up to us. And my mom, she had this plastic bag, even having a plastic bag, like a plastic bag from the West. Once we took the magazines out of it, of course we reused it because we were so proud to have a plastic bag from the West that said Aldi or whatever on it. Ridiculous. Thinking back, it's ridiculous. But yeah, my mom was so proud to have these magazines, like typical female women magazines from the West, and she was flipping through the pages. So it was like a first glimpse into the new system that started the very moment when the wall came down.
Well, to me, when I hear you talking about it, it's also a little, glimpse of the gap probably you experienced later on, you and so many others, in terms of society. So being viewed as probably a second-class German is. Yeah. I know I don't like that term.
Poor second class. Yeah.
It's hard to say inferior. Because we can't. Again, we don't want to generalize here.
Of course not. No.
But overall, the general feeling was like that, and it continued in the 90s as well. Can you probably talk about that time as well, just briefly, from that very, say, colourful event of you going over, buying stuff from the West, which was really cool for you and your family. But then, how did the next years look like, beginning 90s, mid-90s?
Yeah. So when I said at that very moment when the wall came down, we didn't have this feeling of, oh, this is something big that is going to impact us. We had maybe like an idea something is coming, but no one was really sure about what was coming. But then in the 90s it hit. In the 90s, like 92, 93, maybe even earlier, 91, I don't remember, when my mom lost her job. So this is something that shows how my family was impacted by the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the GDR and the ideology, the dictatorship of the East. So my mom lost her job, my dad lost his job. Suddenly in school, we needed to get new school books for me, like totally new school books. And suddenly there is this run for cool clothes because there is this choice now. You could choose from so many things. So this materialistic view of things totally kicked in. But let's come back to what changed for my family. So obviously back then, state-run companies were not existing anymore when the wall came down. So my parents lost their jobs. So my mom, she was lucky enough, or she was smart enough, and maybe she was also at the right time in the right place and said yes at the right moment in time. So she got the opportunity to study, to not just be an accountant, but to study business administration and to graduate with a degree that allowed her to keep on working in her old field, but on a higher level, with a degree that was also recognized in the United Germany, basically. So she was very smart, be there at the right place. But my dad, he had to travel for work, so he was absent for 4 or 5 days a week because he had to work somewhere else, which was in the West, because this is where back then people went for work, because people from the East were also cheaper work power for companies in the West. So my dad was away for work during the week for, I don't remember how many years, but for quite some years. There's this term, Wendeverlierer, people who are victims of somewhat when the wall came down. I'm not saying in no way that my parents would fall into this category, because they didn't. But of course, when the wall came down, it had an impact on my parents. My parents were 30 years old. So they kind of set up their lives. And when you set up a life in the GDR, you were aware of, this is the life that we're going to live for the next decades. And then suddenly everything changed. And my parents did a very good job in setting up a new life in the 90s. And then we had a nice car, and we also went on our first international travel that brought us actually to Slovakia, to the High Tatry, so not really going to the west, but going further east even, because this is something that my parents felt more comfortable with and more familiar with. And we were living kind of a good life, but with sacrifices of having to adapt to new situations.
Coming back to that feeling of being Wendeverlierer, not that your parents were, but we hear that term very often in Germany or in East Germany. Thinking of your little village of 500 people, is there anything you can mention here that you kind of have seen how people try to adjust to the new system, try to fit into that new society? Because when I understood you right, the GDR society was, even though there were so many rules based on communism and the dictatorship, they were based on community, so they were kind of sticking together, but now I wonder if this community fell apart or if it still kind of was holding up each other.
I would say in the 90s things fell apart. Things like they used to be fell apart, and something new was about to emerge. But to adapt to this something new and also create, having a say to what we can create as a something new, this was the big challenge, I would say, because there was not anymore this I don't know, the government that could be seen like a father that took care of their kids. This was gone, so people had the freedom suddenly to take care of themselves, but a lot of people were not used to having the freedom to taking care of themselves and leading a life the way they wanted without having anyone else telling them how to lead their lives. So, for example, there were also people who nowadays you would probably say I don't know, there's a reason why people are unemployed because they're not well enough educated, they're not well enough organized. This is, of course, very black and white, and it's way more complex why people are unemployed or what kind of life people are leading. But back in the GDR, the government took care of everyone. So there was also the duty to go to work. You couldn't just stay at home, or you couldn't just decide, I don't want to work. You had to work. There was no choice. You had to work. No matter your education, there was always something that you could do, and the government made sure that you were doing something. So back then in the 90s, when the whole system fell apart and people were asked to have more responsibility for their lives. Of course, this is a very black and white saying or thinking now, but some people couldn't or didn't manage to take responsibilities for their lives. So there were some people that kind of fell off the radar. They were kind of pushed to the sides. They were left outside, maybe forgotten in a way. And once you're in this position, these kind of people also fell into this loop of that things are not getting any better because there was no one that took care of them anymore. And suddenly also the community of, for example, a village. I don't know if I should go that far to say the community failed, but in the 90s, people were so busy with taking care of themselves and trying to manage to adapt to new situations and trying to, just keep on living their lives. People maybe failed in taking care of others because they just didn't have the capacity to take care of others anymore because there were so many things going on in their own lives.
When adults were so busy building up a new life and a new system, and you were a child back then, or an older child becoming a teenager, how did you process that time, or looking back now, how did you behave?
As long as I was in my environment in Thuringia, for me, life just, kept going on as life was always, because life is, you have your routine, you go to school. Just because if the wall came down, suddenly there's not other people. You're surrounded by the same people. But once you leave, once you go away, and in my case, I went studying at first, and then, but still, I studied in a big city in the east, and I was surrounded by people from the east. However, some professors and lecturers were professors from the west. And with these people, I think in hindsight, I already tried to blend in. So I was maybe even negating where I came from, like unconsciously, unbewusst, how to say this, unconsciously.
Yeah. Just because you feared that they might judge you? Exactly.
And then, especially when I started working abroad, so my first, serious full-time job, I picked up in Poland. And I was teaching German at a Polish university, and there were other German teachers in Poland also teaching at universities. And some of them were people who were born in Germany, in West Germany. And this is when I realized, something is very different. This is when I realized, wait a moment, I'm different, and this has to do with my upbringing in the East. And this is something that maybe I can call an East German identity, which is very important for me. I realized this in comparison with people from the West. I wouldn't say we didn't have anything in common, but there were things we didn't have in common. We were reading different books when we were kids. We were listening to different music. We were eating different cereals. In the East, I didn't eat cereals for breakfast. In the West, people ate cereals for breakfast. I had what did I eat for breakfast? Like a roll with cheese. That's what I had for breakfast every single day, and I liked it. Why not? Because this is what we had. But eating cereals, this is something I started to do in the 90s. So you had this West German brand. This is even an American brand with this tiger on the cover, and it was super, super expensive, super fancy, not very nutritious. But this is what you had suddenly in the 90s because you also tried to blend in. And also negating the dialect from the region you're from, because nowadays, especially in Germany, all the dialects from the East are seen as the most ugly sounding, even gross sounding dialect. And of course, when you know that you can be judged by the words you use or the way you speak and the way your sentences sound, of course you try to avoid being judged on how you sound. And then also when you're having conversations with people like my colleagues from the West, they did all these internships during their studies. They did internships at their father's company, or their mother had like a contact in a publishing house. And then of course they did like an internship at a publishing house and met all those amazing people. I worked at McDonald's in night shifts to be able to afford studying. Of course, I'm not saying that people in the West didn't need to work for their studies, of course. But I also realized in the West, it was more common to concentrate on your career already during your studies.
In the West, I find it quite interesting. People were focusing on their career early on while they were studying at school. And probably for you, it was not the case when you were at an Eastern German school.
No, because I realized my peers from the West, they had a network from their parents that they could rely on. And in the East, there's no network I could rely on. Well, of course, in the East, there were also probably people, but I'm very sure it's a minority that had a network of people in companies, in business and economy. But that's nothing that is common or usual at all.
Well, the networks were destroyed because the companies did no longer exist. And of course, we also have a shift between bigger cities, smaller towns and villages, I guess.
Exactly. And my peers in the West, they could rely on their parents' networks. And for example, my parents, when it came to the decision what I was actually going to study, they said, hey, Mareike, study whatever you like. You can do whatever you want. We're supporting you with whatever you're deciding. And there was no push into one or the other direction. But this also means I was lost in a decision, and there was no role model, there was no guidance, there was no network, there was no stepping stone for whatever career I might face. There was nothing. So it's not just me. In conversations with other peers from the East, we discussed that there was nothing. We started from scratch, which is a total freedom, but it's, well, in comparison to people from the West, it can be seen as a disadvantage. And of course, I'm not saying that everyone in the West had role models and a network to rely on, but it was way more common than it was in the East. And now coming to another thing, and this is, I think, the bigger picture of my bigger personal experience. It's not so much about specific events where people planted the idea that, oh, you're from the East, and it's more about the way I was behaving in situations. So it was more that I always stepped back too much. I was always denying where I was coming from, that I was always denying that I have an opinion that might be an opposing opinion to other people's opinion. I was always withdrawing from conflicts. I was always too humble. I was having too much respect. And at the beginning, I thought, that's me, that's my personality, and I'm an inexperienced young woman. This is how I behave, and I have to learn a lot of my life. Yes, but with all the conversations with other people, females and also males, but mostly females that are also grown up or were born and raised in the GDR, they have the exact same feelings about this. It's almost like we're denying ourselves in social situations. We are almost hiding what we can, what we're capable of. We're hiding our opinion. But I should actually talk in the past, because the very moment when I realized this whole thinking, it's like a different dimension. It's like an underlying unconscious behavior, because this is how I was raised. I was, for example, raised by my parents that I always have to be humble and that I always have to step back because I'm not that important. And I always have to, work hard, but don't expect praise for what I achieve. So I work hard and I achieved probably good things, but you're not talking about this, right? So this is how people were raised in the East. Of course, again, this is my very subjective experience and my very subjective experience about how people work and function in social situations. But the very moment I realized this is not just my personality, this is something more structural. This is more something that East German people or people that were born and raised in the East have in common. I started to work on this and be more confident about what I can, what I do, and actually where I come from. So for the last 10 years, I really embrace my identity of being born in the GDR. And I think it's a very, very valuable part of my existence or of my identity that I cannot, should not, and must not deny, because it's adding value, because it's an experience that not a lot of people have. I profit from this experience because I can take two perspectives in many situations, because I have experience in two different ideologies and systems of a society, and I might have a different perspective on things, and there's no reason why we should withdraw and why we should hide our opinion, or why we should even try to not speak our regional dialect because people might think it sounds gross or just ridiculous. No, we should embrace the identity that we have. It's part of our identity. We should embrace the history and not deny ourselves.
Thank you so much for all that insight. Really appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you for listening to my story.
Thank you for listening. This was an interview recorded by the curator of the Berlin Wall Stories exhibition, Alexandra Falk. We hope you enjoyed it. There are 9 more recorded interviews in this playlist. Maybe you want to explore them as well. Thank you and bis bald.